The blood was already soaking through her dress when the westbound train disappeared around the bend, its iron wheels screaming against the rails as if celebrating what it had done. Grace Lorimer lay crumpled in the alkali dust beside the tracks, her body twisted at an angle that made Garrett Parker's stomach drop even from 200 yards away. He had been checking his fence line when he saw her tumble from the passenger car, thrown like a rag doll into the unforgiving Nevada desert. And now, he drove his spurs into his horses, flanks harder than he ever had in his 24 years of life. The year was 1884, and the desert stretched out in all directions around Pyramid City, Nevada, a mining town that had sprung up 5 years earlier when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. Garrett's ranch sat on the outskirts, where he raised horses and kept to himself, preferring the company of animals to the rough miners and gamblers who populated the saloons. His chestnut mare, Belle, was the fastest horse he owned, and she proved it now as her hooves ate up the distance between him and the fallen woman. Grace tried to lift her head when she heard the thunder of approaching hooves, but the world spun sickeningly. Her ribs felt like broken glass grinding together with each shallow breath. She had been traveling from San Francisco to her sister's home in Salt Lake City when the 3 men had cornered her in the baggage car. She had fought them, scratched one across the face when he tried to grab her traveling bag with the deed papers inside. The conductor had been in on it, she realized now, because no one came when she screamed. They had simply opened the door and thrown her out while the train was still moving at full speed. Garrett pulled Belle to a sliding stop and was on the ground before the dust settled. He dropped to his knees beside Grace, his hands hovering over her body as he tried to assess the damage without moving her. Blood pooled beneath her left side, spreading dark across the pale fabric of her traveling dress. Her face was scraped raw from the gravel, and her left arm lay at an unnatural angle. "Can you hear me?" His voice was rough with urgency. "Miss, can you speak?" Grace's eyes fluttered open, and even through the haze of pain, she registered the intensity in his face. He was young, probably close to her own 22 years, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of summer grass. Dust covered his worn clothes, and his hands were calloused and strong as they carefully pressed against her side, trying to staunch the bleeding. "They took it," she whispered, and blood flecked her lips. "The deed." "Do not try to talk," Garrett said, already shrugging out of his jacket. He wadded it against her side where something sharp, probably a broken rib, had punctured through. "I need to get you to town. The doctor there, he is good, but this is going to hurt." He did not wait for her response. Every second mattered now. He could see how much blood she had already lost, could hear the wet rattle in her breathing that meant internal damage. Garrett slid his arms beneath her as gently as he could manage, but Grace still cried out when he lifted her. The sound cut through him like a knife, but he kept moving, settling her across Belle's saddle before swinging up behind her. He held Grace against his chest, keeping pressure on the wound with one hand while the other guided Belle back toward town. The ride that normally took 20 minutes, Garrett made in 12. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about train tickets and deed papers and men with cold eyes. Each time she went silent, Garrett felt his heart seize with panic, and he would shake her gently, urgently, until she moaned or stirred. He talked to her the whole way, saying anything to keep her anchored to the world. "You are going to be fine. Doc Henderson has seen worse. I know you hurt, but you hang on. What is your name? Can you tell me your name?" "Grace," she managed once, the word barely audible over the pounding hoofbeats. "Grace. That is a good name. I am Garrett, Garrett Parker. You are safe now, Grace. I promise you are safe." Pyramid City's main street was crowded with the usual afternoon traffic when Garrett came thundering through. People scattered as Bell charged past the Mercantile, the Assay office, and the Silver Strike Saloon. He pulled up hard in front of Doc Henderson's office, a small building wedged between the barber and the telegraph office. "Doc," Garrett bellowed, dismounting with Grace still in his arms. "Doc Henderson." The door flew open, and a grizzled man in his 50s emerged, spectacles perched on his nose. Abraham Henderson had been a field surgeon during the war, and his steady hands had saved more lives than most men in Pyramid City had years. He took one look at Grace's pale face and Garrett's blood-soaked shirt and stepped back to let them through. "Exam table. Now." Doc Henderson was already rolling up his sleeves. "What happened?" "Thrown from the westbound train," Garrett said, laying Grace down as carefully as he could. "Puncture wound in her side, broken arm, maybe broken ribs. She has been bleeding for at least 15 minutes. Doc Henderson cut away Grace's dress with practiced efficiency, exposing the wound. It was deep, a jagged tear where she had landed on something sharp, probably a rock. Blood welled up steadily, and the doctor pressed clean cloths against it while he examined the rest of her injuries. "You did right bringing her straight here," Doc said, his voice calm despite the severity of what he saw. "But you need to step outside now, son. I have work to do. I am staying." Garrett's voice was firm. Doc Henderson glanced up, ready to argue, but something in the young man's face stopped him. He had seen that look before on soldiers who refused to leave their wounded brothers. "Fine. But you do exactly what I say when I say it. Understood?" For the next hour, Garrett followed every order. He held Grace down when Doc Henderson cleaned the wound, her back arching off the table as she screamed. He steadied her arm while the doctor set the bone, feeling the grind of it through her flesh. He sponged blood from her scraped face while Doc stitched the puncture wound closed with neat, precise movements. And when Grace finally fell into a morphine-induced sleep, her breathing shallow but steady, Garrett sank into a chair and put his head in his hands. "She will live," Doc Henderson said, washing blood from his hands in a basin. "But it was close. Another 10 minutes and she would have bled out. You saved her life, Parker." Garrett looked up at the woman on the table. Someone had cleaned most of the blood away, and in sleep, despite the bruises and bandages, he could see that she was beautiful. Dark hair spread across the pillow, and her features held a delicate strength that spoke of good breeding and education. "Who is she?" Doc asked, following Garrett's gaze. "Said her name was Grace. That is all I know." Garrett stood and moved closer to the table. "She said something about a deed, said they took it before they threw her off." Doc Henderson's expression darkened. "Robbery, then. This territory is getting more lawless by the day." He dried his hands and reached for his coat. "I need to inform Sheriff Dalton. You will stay with her." It was not really a question, and Garrett nodded. After Doc left, he pulled his chair close to the exam table and settled in to wait. He studied Grace's face, wondering about her story. The quality of her ruined dress suggested money, and she spoke with the accent of someone educated. What was a woman like that doing alone on a train through Nevada? And what deed had been worth killing her for? Grace woke slowly, fighting through layers of darkness and pain. Her mouth was dry as cotton and every part of her body throbbed. When she managed to open her eyes, she found herself staring at an unfamiliar ceiling. Panic seized her and she tried to sit up, but firm hands pressed her shoulders back down. "Easy now. You are safe." She turned her head and found Garrett sitting beside her. The last thing she clearly remembered was falling, the world spinning as the ground rushed up to meet her. Everything after that was fragments, pain and motion, and a voice telling her to hang on. "You," she whispered. "You found me. Found you and got you to Doc Henderson in time." Garrett reached for a cup of water and carefully helped her drink. "How do you feel?" "Like I was thrown from a train." Grace managed a weak smile, then winced as it pulled at the scrapes on her face. "Where am I?" "Pyramid City, Nevada." Doc's office. Garrett set the cup aside. "Do you remember what happened?" Grace closed her eyes and Garrett saw her jaw tighten. "3 men. They wanted my traveling bag. Inside was the deed to my father's silver claim. He died 6 months ago, left it to me and my sister. I was bringing it to her in Salt Lake City so we could sell it together." Her voice cracked. "They took it, and when I fought back they threw me off the train. Did you see their faces? 2 of them wore bandanas. But the third one, the one who grabbed my bag, he had a scar running from his eye to his jaw. And the conductor, he just stood there and watched. He was in on it." Garrett felt anger burn hot in his chest. "The sheriff needs to hear this. Doc went to fetch him. What good will that do?" Grace's voice was bitter. "By now they are long gone, and I have nothing. No money, no deed, nothing." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "My sister is counting on me. That claim is all we have left of our father, and now it is gone." Garrett found himself reaching out, his rough hand covering her smaller one. "You are alive. That is what matters." Grace looked at him then, really looked at him. His clothes were still stained with her blood and exhaustion shadowed his eyes. He had stayed with her, this stranger who had saved her life. "Thank you," she said softly. "I never properly thanked you. You risked your horse, your time. You saved my life. Any decent man would have done the same, perhaps, but you were the one who did." Grace squeezed his hand weakly. "I owe you everything." The door opened and Doc Henderson entered with a tall man wearing a tin star. Sheriff Roy Dalton was in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He removed his hat when he saw Grace was awake. "Miss Lorimer, I am Sheriff Dalton. I need to ask you some questions about what happened, if you are up to it." Grace told her story again, with more details this time. She described each of the 3 men as best she could, the conductor's indifference, the moment when they had opened the baggage car door and simply pushed her out. The sheriff took notes, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "The conductor's name was Sam Bridges," Dalton said when she finished. "He has been working that line for 3 years, never had any complaints about him before." "Maybe someone paid him enough to change his character," Garrett said darkly. The sheriff nodded. "That deed you mentioned for a silver claim, you have any papers proving it was yours?" Grace felt her stomach sink. "The deed itself was the proof. My father's will is with my sister in Salt Lake City. Without proof of ownership, even if we recover the deed, it will be hard to establish it belongs to you." Dalton shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I will send telegrams to the stops along the line, see if anyone saw those men. But I will be honest with you, miss. Chances of getting your property back are slim." After the sheriff left, Grace stared at the ceiling, trying not to cry. Everything she and her sister had hoped for was gone. The claim would have been enough to give them both fresh starts, maybe even help her sister's husband with his struggling freight business. Now there was nothing. "Where will you go?" Garrett asked quietly. "I do not know. I cannot go to my sister empty-handed. She and her husband have barely enough to feed themselves." Grace's voice was hollow. "I suppose I will have to find work here, earn enough for a train ticket back to San Francisco. Maybe I can find employment as a governess or a seamstress." "You cannot even sit up without help," Garrett pointed out. "It will be weeks before you are healed enough to work. Then I will figure something out when that time comes." Grace turned her face away, not wanting him to see how frightened she truly was. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You could come stay at my ranch, just until you are healed. I have a spare room. You would have time to recover and figure out your next step." Grace looked at him sharply. I could not impose like that. You have already done so much. It is not an imposition. The place is too quiet anyway. Garrett met her eyes steadily. You need somewhere to recover, and I have the space. Doc will tell you the same thing. You cannot stay here indefinitely, and you should not be alone while you are healing. Doc Henderson, who had been changing bandages in the corner, spoke up. He is right, Miss Lorimer. You need rest and care. Garrett's ranch is clean and quiet, and he is a responsible young man. I have known him since he moved here 4 years ago. Grace wanted to refuse. She had been raised to be independent, to solve her own problems, but she also knew that she had no other options. Just until I am well enough to travel, she said finally, and I will find a way to repay you. No need for talk of repayment. Garrett stood and reached for his hat. I will go prepare the spare room. Doc, when can she be moved? Give her another day or 2 here, make sure infection does not set in. Then she should be all right to travel, as long as you keep her still and quiet. 3 days later, Garrett returned with a wagon, the bed padded with blankets and pillows. Grace had improved enough to sit up for short periods, though her side still pulled painfully and her arm remained splinted. Doc Henderson helped Garrett lift her into the wagon, giving him a long list of instructions about changing bandages and watching for signs of fever. The ride to Garrett's ranch took them out of town and into the open desert. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, all sagebrush and distant mountains under an endless sky. Grace lay back against the pillows, watching clouds drift overhead and trying not to jostle too much on the rough road. How did you come to own a ranch out here? She asked when the silence grew too long. Garrett kept his eyes on the horses pulling the wagon. Saved up working cattle drives and bought the land cheap from a man who wanted to go back east. Built the house and barn myself. Been raising horses for 3 years now. Do you have family? Not anymore. Parents died when I was 16. Fever took them both within a week. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Grace heard the old pain beneath it. I have been on my own since then. I am sorry. I know what it is like to lose parents. Grace shifted carefully, trying to find a more comfortable position. My mother died when I was 10. My father never really recovered. He threw himself into mining, searching for the big strike that would change everything. When he finally found it, the work was what killed him. His heart gave out. But he left you and your sister provided for. He tried. That deed was supposed to be our future. Grace felt the bitterness rise again and pushed it down. I suppose some things are not meant to be. Garrett's ranch appeared as they crested a low rise. It was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy house built of wood and stone, a large barn and several corrals. Horses grazed in the nearest pasture, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Everything spoke of hard work and careful attention. It is beautiful, Grace said, and meant it. Garrett felt an unexpected warmth at her words. He pulled the wagon up to the house and carefully helped Grace down. She was unsteady on her feet, and he ended up half carrying her inside. The interior was clean but sparse, furnished with handmade furniture and few decorations. He took her to the spare bedroom, which held a simple bed, a dresser, and a window overlooking the pastures. It is not fancy, Garrett said, suddenly aware of how plain everything must seem to someone who had been raised with money. It is perfect. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion washing over her. The short trip had drained what little strength she had recovered. Garrett helped her settle against the pillows, then brought water and the laudanum Doc Henderson had sent. I will fix some supper in a bit. You rest. Over the next week, they fell into a routine. Garrett would check on Grace first thing in the morning, helping her wash and dress in the simple cotton nightgowns he had bought from the mercantile. He brought her breakfast in bed, then went about his work with the horses while she rested. At midday, he would return to change her bandages and bring lunch. Evenings they spent together, Garrett reading aloud from the few books he owned while Grace listened from her bed. As the days passed, Grace grew stronger. The wound in her side began to heal, though it still pulled painfully if she moved wrong. Her broken arm itched terribly beneath the splint, but worst of all was the restlessness. She was not accustomed to lying idle, and being dependent on Garrett's care chafed at her pride. "I should be helping," she said one afternoon when Garrett brought her lunch. "I feel useless just lying here. You are healing. That is what you should be doing." Garrett set the tray across her lap. "Besides, what would you do? You can barely walk to the privy without getting winded." "I could mend clothes, or prepare vegetables for supper, something." Grace picked at the food, frustration clear in every line of her body. "You are already doing so much for me. I hate being such a burden." "You are not a burden." Garrett pulled up the chair he had taken to keeping beside her bed. "And if you want to help, you can tell me more about that silver claim. Maybe there is still a way to get it back." Grace looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean? The deed was for a claim near here, was it not? Your father found silver in this territory." "Yes, about 20 miles north of Pyramid City. A place called Whiskey Gulch." Garrett leaned forward. "I know Whiskey Gulch. There are maybe a dozen active claims up there. If we can figure out which one was your father's, we might be able to establish your ownership through the mining registry." The original claim would have been filed with the territorial office. Hope flickered in Grace's chest for the first time since the attack. "Do you really think so?" "It is worth trying." "What was your father's name?" "Henry Lorimer. He filed the claim 3 years ago in 1881. Garrett stood, sudden purpose in his movements. "I will ride into town tomorrow, check the registry records. Even if those men have the deed, they cannot file a claim on property that is already registered to someone else, not without raising questions." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but this time from gratitude rather than despair. "Why are you doing all this? You do not even know me." Garrett paused at the door. "Maybe not. But I know you did not deserve what happened to you, and I know that if I can help make it right, I should." He left before she could respond, but his words stayed with her long after his footsteps faded. That night, Grace lay awake thinking about the cowboy who had saved her life. Garrett Parker was unlike any man she had known in San Francisco. He was quiet and self-contained, more comfortable with horses than people. But there was a bedrock decency in him, a straightforward honesty that she found increasingly appealing. The way he cared for her, with such patient gentleness, stirred something in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. The next morning, Garrett rose before dawn and saddled Belle. Grace heard him moving around and called out. He appeared in her doorway, dressed for travel with his hat in his hands. "I am heading to town," he said. "Should be back by late afternoon. There is food prepared in the kitchen, and Doc Henderson said it is fine for you to walk around a bit as long as you take it slow." "Be careful," Grace said, then felt foolish. Why would a trip to town require caution? But Garrett just nodded, something warming in his expression. "I will." After he left, Grace forced herself out of bed. Her legs were shaky and her side ached, but it felt good to move. She made her way slowly to the kitchen, stopping to rest when she got winded. The house was quiet around her, and she found herself studying the space with new interest. Garrett kept his home clean but impersonal, as if he had never quite committed to the idea of it being permanent. There were no photographs, no mementos, nothing that spoke of a life beyond work and survival. Grace found that unbearably sad. She began, slowly and carefully, to tidy up. She washed the breakfast dishes, swept the floors, and even managed to prepare vegetables for stew before exhaustion forced her back to bed. Garrett returned in late afternoon, his saddlebags heavy. He found Grace sleeping in her room and took a moment to watch her. 2 weeks had passed since he pulled her from the dust beside the tracks, and already she looked different. Color had returned to her face, and the worst of the scrapes were healing. She was beautiful, he acknowledged, but it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a resilience that matched this harsh land. Grace's eyes opened, and she caught him staring. "Did you find anything?" Garrett cleared his throat and entered the room properly. "I did. Your father's claim is registered, filed in July of 1881. The Lucky Grace claim, he called it. He pulled papers from his saddlebag. Named after you, I would guess." Grace sat up carefully, emotion flooding through her. "He never told me that. What else did you learn?" "The claim is still listed as active and in Henry Lorimer's name. No one has tried to transfer ownership or file against it, which means those men who took your deed probably have not tried to use it yet." "Why would they wait?" Garrett sat down, his expression thoughtful. "Because they need time to forge documents that would make the transfer look legitimate. Or maybe they are waiting for things to cool down. Either way, we have a window to act." "Act how?" "I sent a telegram to your sister in Salt Lake City, asking her to send a copy of your father's will and any other documents that prove you and she are his heirs. With those, we can go to the territorial office and establish your claim. The deed those men stole becomes worthless." Grace stared at him, stunned. "You thought of all that in one afternoon?" "I had a lot of time to think on the ride." Garrett pulled out another paper. "I also stopped by the sheriff's office. Dalton got a report back from one of his telegrams. A man matching the description of your scarred attacker was seen in Virginia City 3 days ago. He was asking around about someone to forge legal documents." "Virginia City?" "That is what, a 2-day ride from here." "About that." Garrett met her eyes. "If the sheriff moves fast, he might be able to catch them before they finish whatever they are planning." Grace reached out and caught Garrett's hand. "Thank you. I do not know how to properly express what this means to me." Garrett looked down at their joined hands, his calloused fingers rough against her soft skin. "You do not have to thank me, Grace." "Yes, I do," she squeezed gently. "You have given me hope when I had none. You have cared for me, fought for me, and you barely know me. That is not something I will forget." They stayed like that for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Garrett carefully withdrew his hand and stood. "I should start supper. You must be hungry." Grace watched him go, her heart beating faster than her injuries warranted. Something was growing between them, something that went beyond gratitude and kindness. She recognized it in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, in the gentle care of his hands when he changed her bandages, in the way his voice softened when he said her name. As the days passed, Grace continued to heal. She began helping more around the house, preparing meals and doing light chores. Garrett protested at first, worried she would overextend herself, but Grace insisted. She needed to feel useful, to contribute something to the household that had taken her in. They fell into an easy companionship. Garrett taught her about the horses he raised, walking her slowly out to the corrals to meet the animals. Grace discovered she had a natural way with them, and Garrett found himself watching her interact with a young filly he had been training, smiling at the way she spoke softly and moved confidently despite her injuries. "You have done this before," he observed. Grace stroked the filly's nose. "My father kept horses before he caught silver fever. I used to spend hours in the stables." She glanced at Garrett. "I had forgotten how much I missed it. You could stay, you know, after you are healed." The words came out before Garrett could stop them. "I mean, if you wanted work. I could use help with the horses." Grace turned to look at him fully, and Garrett felt heat rise in his face. "That is, I know you probably want to go to your sister or back to San Francisco. I just thought, if you needed a place to stay. Are you offering me a job, Garrett Parker? I suppose I am. He met her eyes, suddenly serious. You are good with the horses, and you fit here. I have not had anyone to talk to in a long time, and I find that I enjoy your company. Grace felt her breath catch. I enjoy your company as well, very much. They stood there in the warm Nevada sun, the horses moving quietly around them, and Grace felt something shift in her chest. She had not expected this when she boarded that train in San Francisco. She had not expected any of it. Not the attack, not the cowboy who saved her, and certainly not the way her heart beat faster whenever he was near. I will think about it, she said softly. After we sort out the claim and I am properly healed, but I will think about it. 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, a telegram came from her sister. Martha Lorimer Hutchins had sent copies of their father's will and other documentation, along with a worried message asking if Grace was all right. Grace sent a telegram back explaining what had happened and assuring her sister she was recovering. With the documents in hand, Garrett and Grace made the trip to the territorial office in Carson City. Grace was still healing, so they took it slow, stopping frequently to rest. Garrett had borrowed a proper carriage from a neighbor, wanting Grace to be as comfortable as possible for the journey. The territorial office was housed in a stone building in the center of town. A clerk with ink-stained fingers examined their documents with painstaking care, comparing signatures and dates. Finally, he looked up. Everything appears to be in order. The Lucky Grace claim is registered to Henry Lorimer, deceased. As his legal heirs, you and your sister have full rights to the property. He prepared new documentation. I will note in the registry that ownership has been verified through probate. If anyone attempts to file a conflicting claim, we will know it is fraudulent. Grace felt weak with relief. So the deed those men stole is worthless, without supporting documentation. And given that we now have proper probate records, yes. They could try to sell it to someone who does not check the registry carefully, but any legitimate buyer would discover the fraud. The clerk handed them the new papers. Your claim is secure, Miss Lorimer. Outside, Grace turned to Garrett with shining eyes. We did it. The claim is safe. You did it, Garrett corrected. You survived long enough for this to be possible. Grace acted on impulse, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. We did it together. Garrett stood very still, aware of every place her body touched his. Grace. She pulled back, suddenly shy. I am sorry, that was forward of me. Do not apologize. Garrett reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I am not sorry. They stood there on the street in Carson City, the world moving around them, and Grace felt certain that this moment mattered. That everything had led to this. The train, the fall, the cowboy who saved her, and now this quiet understanding passing between them. I want to stay, Grace said. At your ranch, not just until I heal. If the offer is still open, I want to stay. The offer is open. Garrett's voice was rough with emotion. For as long as you want it. The ride back to Pyramid City felt different. Grace sat close to Garrett on the carriage seat, and his arm rested along the back, not quite touching her but close enough that she felt the warmth of him. They talked about the ranch, about the horses, about what would need to be done before winter came. They talked about Grace's share of the silver claim, and she mentioned she could sell her half to her sister's husband, give them the fresh start they needed. That is generous, Garrett said. My father found that silver trying to provide for us. It is only right that Martha benefits from it. Grace was quiet for a moment. Besides, I find I do not need it anymore. I have everything I want right here. Garrett looked at her, and Grace met his gaze steadily. Grace, I need to say something. What is it? I know we have not known each other long, less than 2 months, but I feel like I have been waiting for you my whole life." He pulled the carriage to a stop. "You make my house feel like a home. You make me want things I never let myself want before. A future, a family, someone to share all this with." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "Garrett, I am not good with words and I do not have much to offer. Just a ranch and some horses and a man who works too hard and does not talk enough." Garrett took her hand. "But if you will have me, Grace Lorimer, I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "That sounds remarkably like a proposal, Garrett Parker." "I suppose it is." He met her eyes, and Grace saw vulnerability there and hope, and something that looked very much like love. "Will you marry me?" Grace answered by kissing him properly this time, her good arm coming around his neck. Garrett pulled her close, careful of her injuries but unable to help the surge of joy that went through him when she said against his lips, "Yes, yes, I will marry you." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Pyramid City. Doc Henderson gave Grace away, and Sheriff Dalton stood as Garrett's witness. Grace wore a simple blue dress from the Mercantile, and Garrett had gotten his hair cut and wore his best clothes. Martha could not make the journey on such short notice, but she sent a telegram of congratulations and blessing. Grace's arm was still splinted and her side still tender, but she had never felt more whole. When Garrett kissed her at the end of the ceremony, she felt like she had finally found the place where she belonged. That night, in the house that was now theirs together, Garrett carried Grace over the threshold despite her laughing protests that she could walk perfectly well. He set her down carefully in the bedroom he had prepared, the one that had been his alone but now belonged to both of them. "I love you," Grace said, the words coming easily. "I should have said it before, but I was afraid that it was too soon or that you did not feel the same." "I love you too," Garrett said, and the words felt right, felt like something he had been holding inside for weeks. "From the moment I saw you fall, something in me knew you were going to change everything." They made love slowly and carefully, Garrett mindful of her healing injuries, Grace marveling at the tenderness in his rough hands. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, listening to the wind move across the desert outside. "Tell me about the train," Garrett said quietly. "The moment before they threw you. What were you thinking?" Grace was silent for so long he thought she had fallen asleep. Then she said, "I was thinking about my father, about how hard he worked and how little time we had together at the end. I was thinking that I had failed, that I had lost the one thing he left us." She turned to look at Garrett in the moonlight. "I was thinking I was going to die alone in the dust and no one would ever know what happened to me. But you did not die. No, because you rode hard to reach me. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." Grace kissed him softly. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you had not been checking your fence that day, if you had not seen me fall." "I would have seen you fall," Garrett said with certainty. "Somehow, someway, I would have found you. I was meant to find you, Grace." She settled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Yes, I believe you were." The winter that year was mild by Nevada standards, which was fortunate because Grace and Garrett spent most of it working to expand the ranch. With the money from Grace's share of the silver claim, which Martha's husband had bought at a fair price, they were able to purchase more horses and hire a young hand named Timothy to help with the work. Grace proved to have a natural talent for training horses, particularly the young ones. She was patient and gentle, and the animals responded to her in ways that amazed even Garrett. Together, they built the ranch into one of the most respected horse operations in the territory. News eventually came that Sheriff Dalton had caught the men who attacked Grace. They were arrested in Virginia City trying to sell forged ownership papers for the Lucky Grace claim. The scarred man turned out to be wanted for robbery in 3 territories, and all 3 men, including the conductor, were sentenced to prison. Grace testified at the trial, with Garrett beside her. Seeing the men in chains, she felt no satisfaction, only a strange emptiness. They had tried to kill her for greed, had thrown her from a moving train without a second thought. But their actions had also led her to Garrett, to the life she now lived. She could not bring herself to thank them, but neither could she muster real hatred. "Justice is served," Garrett said as they left the courthouse. "Yes," Grace took his hand, "and now we can truly leave it behind." As spring came and the desert bloomed in unexpected colors, Grace discovered she was pregnant. Doc Henderson confirmed it, and Garrett received the news with a joy so profound he could barely speak. He held Grace that night with a reverence that made her cry happy tears against his shoulder. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." Their son was born on a warm October evening in 1885, with Doc Henderson attending and Garrett pacing anxiously in the next room. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst through the door to find Grace exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle in her arms. "Meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse from the long labor. Garrett approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Grace's delicate features. When the infant wrapped a tiny hand around Garrett's finger, he felt something in his chest expand so large he thought he might burst with it. "We should name him Henry," Garrett said, "after your father." Grace smiled through her tears. "Henry Parker. I like that." They were a family now, complete in ways neither had imagined possible 2 years ago when Grace had fallen from that train. Garrett had thought his life was set, that he would work his ranch alone until he was old and pass it on to no one. Grace had thought her future held only obligation and duty to her sister. Instead, they had found each other, and everything had changed. As the years passed, the ranch prospered. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah, and another son they called William. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Garrett building on new rooms with his own hands. Grace taught all 3 children to ride and handle horses, passing on the skills she had learned from her father and honed with Garrett. Pyramid City grew too, transforming from a rough mining town into a more settled community. Garrett and Grace became respected members of the town, known for their fair dealing and the quality of their horses. Grace never forgot where she came from or how close she had come to death on that desert afternoon. She lived each day with gratitude and purpose, pouring love into her family and her work. On their 10th anniversary, Garrett took Grace up to the spot where he had found her. The railroad track still ran through the desert, and sage still grew thick along the embankment. But standing there now, healthy and strong, Grace felt no fear or sadness. "Sometimes I dream about it," she admitted. "The falling. But then I wake up and you are there, and I remember that the falling led me to you." Garrett pulled her close, his wife and his love, and looked out over the land they had built their life upon. "I remember seeing you fall and thinking I had never ridden so hard in my life, that if I did not reach you in time, something essential would be lost from the world." "You reached me," Grace said simply. "You reached me, and you saved me, and you loved me. Everything else came from that." They stood together in the desert silence, 2 people who had found each other against all odds. The train that had carried Grace west had meant to kill her, but instead it had delivered her to her future. To the cowboy who had seen her fall and ridden hard to reach her. To the love that had grown from that desperate rescue into something deep and enduring. As they walked back to their horses, Grace looked back once at the spot where she had landed all those years ago. The blood was long since washed away by rain and wind, but the memory remained, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of how quickly life could change. How one moment could alter everything. "Thank you," she said softly, though she was not sure if she was speaking to Garrett, to fate, or to whatever force had put him in that field on that particular day. Garrett heard her anyway. "Always," he said. "For as long as I live, I will always be the man who rides hard to reach you." And he was. The children grew strong and capable. Henry inherited his mother's way with horses and his father's steady temperament. He eventually took over the main operations of the ranch, expanding it even further with his parents' blessing. Sarah proved to have a head for numbers and managed the business side of things, keeping the books and negotiating sales with buyers who came from as far away as California. William became a veterinarian, studying back east before returning to Nevada to care for animals throughout the territory. Grace and Garrett grew old together, their hands weathered by work, but still seeking each other's touch. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the land they had built together, and talked about everything and nothing. They remembered the early days, the fear and uncertainty, and marveled at how far they had come. "You ever regret it?" Garrett asked one evening when they were both in their 60s. "Staying here instead of going to San Francisco or joining your sister in Salt Lake City. You could have had an easier life." Grace looked at him, at the man who had saved her and loved her and built a life with her. His hair was white now, his face lined by years of sun and wind, but his eyes still held the same steady strength that had drawn her from the first. "I have never regretted a single day," she said. "This is exactly the life I was meant to live. You are exactly the man I was meant to love." Garrett reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "I saw you fall," he said, as he had said so many times over the years, "and I rode hard to reach you." "You reached me," Grace replied, the familiar words a comfort and a promise. "You saved me." "We saved each other," Garrett corrected, and Grace knew he was right. The ranch continued to thrive through the generations. Grace's sister Martha came to visit often, marveling at what her sister had built. She brought her own children, and they grew up knowing their cousins and learning to ride horses in the Nevada desert. The lucky Grace claim eventually played out, as all mines do, but the money it had provided helped establish two families and gave them security in uncertain times. Doc Henderson lived to be 92, still practicing medicine until the year he died. He was there for the birth of every one of Grace and Garrett's grandchildren, and he never let them forget that he had been the one to stitch Grace back together that first desperate day. Sheriff Dalton retired and became a rancher himself, often trading horses with Garrett and becoming one of their closest friends. Pyramid City never grew into a big city, but it remained a prosperous town, its identity shifting from mining to ranching as the silver played out and the land proved better suited to other purposes. The Parker Ranch became a landmark, the place people pointed to when they talked about what hard work and love could build. Grace lived to be 78 years old. She remained active until the end, still walking out to the corrals to check on the horses even when her children protested that she should rest. On her last day, she sat on the porch with Garrett, watching a summer storm roll across the desert. "You remember the rain the night after we married?" she asked, her voice soft. "I remember everything," Garrett said. He held her hand gently, aware of how fragile she had become but still seeing in her the strong young woman who had survived being thrown from a train. "I want you to know that I have been happy," Grace said. "Every day with you has been a gift. The fall, the pain, all of it was worth it because it brought me to you, Grace." Garrett's voice broke. She squeezed his hand. "I am not afraid. I have lived a full life, loved deeply, and raised good children. What more could anyone ask for?" That night, Grace passed quietly in her sleep, Garrett holding her close. He woke to find her gone, and the grief that washed over him was as vast as the desert that surrounded their home. But underneath, the pain was gratitude, because he had been blessed with 53 years of marriage to a woman he loved more than life itself. Garrett lived another 5 years. He remained on the ranch, working alongside his children and grandchildren, teaching them everything he knew. He spoke often of Grace, keeping her memory alive through stories told around the dinner table and quiet moments on the porch where they had spent so many evenings together. On what would have been their 58th wedding anniversary, Garrett rode out to the spot where he had found Grace. He was 83 years old, and the ride took more out of him than it once would have, but he needed to make this journey one last time. He stood beside the railroad tracks, remembering that day with perfect clarity. The train disappearing around the bend, the blood spreading across pale fabric. The desperate ride to reach her in time, and he remembered everything that had come after, the love, the family, the life they had built together. "I rode hard to reach you," Garrett said to the wind and the memory, "and I would do it again. 1,000 times I would do it again." He returned to the ranch as the sun was setting. His children had prepared a special dinner in honor of the anniversary, and the house was full of family. 3 generations gathered under one roof. They ate and talked and laughed, and Garrett felt Grace's presence in every moment, every smile, every shared memory. That night, Garrett went to sleep in the bed he had shared with Grace for more than 50 years. He closed his eyes and for the first time since she died, felt at peace. In his dreams, he was young again, riding Belle hard across the desert. And there ahead of him was Grace, waiting as she always had, ready to be caught before she fell too far. Garrett Parker died in his sleep, and his children found him in the morning with a smile on his face. They buried him beside Grace on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the endless Nevada sky they had both loved. The graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives, but the real monument to their love was all around. The ranch they had built, the family they had raised, and the story that would be passed down through generations. The story of the woman who was thrown from a moving train, and the cowboy who saw her fall and rode hard to reach her before she bled out. The story of how that desperate moment had become the beginning of everything. How love had grown from dust and blood and determination into something that lasted beyond any single lifetime. The Parker Ranch remained in the family for generations, each new caretaker adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation Grace and Garrett had laid. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved across the desert, and the sun painted the sky in impossible colors, people swore they could see 2 figures on the porch, hands intertwined, watching over the land and the family they had created together. It was a story of survival and love, of second chances and steadfast devotion. It was the story of Grace and Garrett Parker, and it reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. That falling can be the beginning of learning to fly. And that true love, once found, never really ends. It simply changes form, becoming part of the land, the legacy, and the endless story of those who came before and those who would come after. The Parker family carried that story forward, each generation learning the truth that Grace and Garrett had lived. That love built on sacrifice and nurtured through hard times could weather anything. That the measure of a life was not in how much you accumulated, but in how much you gave and how deeply you loved. And so the story lived on, as all the best stories do, changing slightly with each telling but always maintaining its essential truth. She was thrown from a moving train. A cowboy saw her fall and rode hard to reach her before she bled out. He saved her life, she healed his heart, and together they built something that would outlast them both. It was a simple story, really, but it was theirs, and it was perfect.